So, first of all, I want to thank you for being here with me. Second of all, I saw the letter that you wrote to the WGA, the Writers Guild. You resigned over their silence on Israel. Now, I guess my first question is, will you ever rejoin? And does the Guild allow writers to rejoin after they elect a FICOR status?
The answer to the latter is no. Once you've resigned and elected to go financial core, you can never rejoin the Guild.
Okay. So you just decided you're done because they were silent. They weren't speaking
Well,
up
it,
about
it wasn't
Israel.
a spur of the moment decision. Weeks went by without them saying a word. They were certainly asked to say a word. There were 300 writers who had a meeting with them and said, guys, this is the worst slaughter in the Middle East. Forget about Jews. This is the worst slaughter of a religious minority in the Middle East since ISIS slaughtered the Yazidi people. So if you, let's say you don't particularly care for Jews, just put it in perspective. This is something you need to denounce, and it's going to unleash untold misery to both the Israeli and the Palestinian people. And the Guild stayed silent. And just with regard to that, all the people who are dead or suffering in Gaza today were all of them, without exception, alive and well on October 6th. The reason they are dead or suffering today is because on October 7th, Hamas decided to break the ceasefire that was in effect to invade Israel. You have to understand that Hamas is not just a terrorist movement, and I really am irked when I hear people refer to it that way. Israel left Gaza completely in 2005. There are two borders between Gaza and various countries. One was a border that was with Israel, and Israel controlled the Israeli side of that border. The other border was with Egypt, and that border is not anything that we controlled. The Egyptians did. The Egyptians closed that border because Hamas, quite frankly, was making an alliance with ISIS in Sinai against the Egyptian government. So Egypt, to protect itself, closed a border. But Gaza enjoyed all the characteristics of a state. If you look up any definition of what a state is, defined borders, stable population, strong central government, a very impressive military. And by the way, they were elected in quite democratic elections. So what happened on October 6th was the de facto state of Gaza invaded the state of Israel and instituted a war, so that all those people who are suffering right now, just as Japan bore the responsibility for World War II, so does the de facto state of Hamas Gaza bear the responsibility for all that's happened since then. There's no rule of warfare that says you can start a war and then complain because you're losing it. Terrible things happened to the German people during World War II. 1 million German civilians were killed during World War II. Do you know how many American civilians were killed by Germany on American soil in World War II? Zero. So the idea of, oh, let's count up the casualties and that's how we'll determine morality is a false equivalency. The reason the German people suffered in World War II was because they made the tragic mistake of electing Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, knowing exactly who he was and what they were and what their plans were, and cheering them on.
Right. And Adolf
So,
Hitler was an unemployed veteran who for some reason blamed the Jews for World War One.
yeah, I think Jew hatred, honestly, I think it's demonic because there's no logical explanation for it. It's the oldest racial hatred in humanity. And in countries where Jews have assimilated, they were hated for assimilating, for trying to be like the majority. Where they didn't assimilate, they were hated for being different. Where they succeeded, they were hated because they were too successful. Where they were poor, they were hated because they were a blight and they were too poor. So there's no logical reason behind Jew hatred. I mean, I honestly, if you want proof that the devil exists, I think you have to look no farther than Jew hatred. At any rate, back to the original point. In the face of all that, the WGA, in their response to 300 writers who asked them to come out and condemn Hamas, stated they could not reach a consensus. At that point, I thought, if you can't reach a consensus decrying gang rape, mass murder, burning people alive, beheading people, none of those things, by the way, are in doubt. There's forensic evidence on everything I just said. Murdering children in front of their parents and parents in front of their children. If you can't find a consensus to condemn that, it is not that your moral compass is broken, it's that you don't have one. And so I just said, I choose not to be a fellow traveler with people whose moral compass is so lacking.
And Hollywood, we wouldn't really have a Hollywood as we know it today without Jewish people, without Jewish men and women.
The Jews invented the motion picture
They did.
industry.
Yeah, and established the studios here, and and the fact that Hollywood is being silent on it, and any Hollywood actor that speaks up on it is being chastised. It's shocking to see that, especially in this community.
Yeah, to their credit, both SAG and the DGA issued statements almost immediately condemning Hamas, and that made the WGA's cowardice even more glaring. But now you're right. I said to several friends, the narrative is going to shift. This was on October 8th, when there were demonstrations not calling for a ceasefire or decrying any Palestinian loss of life, but in solidarity with the terrorists who had just committed mass murder. And I said, well, if that's the case, it won't be weeks, it will be days before the narrative is not that Israel is the victim of a massacre, but that Hamas and the residents of Gaza are the victim of Israeli genocide. And that's really when I approached TBN and said, I would like to do a documentary because I know that this is, the lie is about to set in. Holocaust denial will be on steroids compared to this.
You're not kidding. Let's get to that documentary. You have the 4-part documentary. It's there's 4 different parts to it. Let's see, the heroism, it's the horror, the heroism, the hope, hysteria, and hatred. I think we're at the hysteria and hatred section right now in America, where we're seeing all of these protests and whatnot. But let's get back to October 7th. You had loved ones in the kibbutz. In fact, you grew up, you went to a kibbutz when you were, it was 13 or 16 years old.
16, yes.
You were 16 years old and you lived in a kibbutz. You went to high school there in Israel, and then you were a reserve soldier in the IDF. Is that correct?
I ran away from home at 16 with my parents' active blessing and encouragement, wound up on a kibbutz in Israel, came back to go to university, went back, was drafted into the Israeli army, served during the Yom Kippur War as a soldier in the regular army. And then after my enlistment or my draft service was up, like everybody else, I became a reserve soldier, and I served in reserves from the end of my term in regular army, which was in 1975, until 2018. So that's 45 years. It's a long time to be in that army.
So let me ask you this, because you were a reserve army soldier in the IDF, but you also, again, had loved ones in the kibbutz when October 7th happened, when the Hamas attacks occurred. How did you learn about the attacks?
I was actually messaging on WhatsApp my adopted sister Sarah, who lives in a kibbutz on the Gaza border, about 3,000 meters from the border. And it was a holiday. She's religious, and so she turns her phone off on the Sabbath and on holidays. And so I had just sent her a holiday greeting, thinking I wouldn't hear anything until the following day after the Sabbath. And then there was the little ding on my WhatsApp. And I thought something is drastically wrong, because she is religious and would never turn her phone on unless a war was going on. And I said, what is happening? And she said the most hellacious rocket fire she had ever seen. And she spent her whole life on that kibbutz. And it was, a barrage of thousands of rockets, which gave cover to the terrorists who invaded. It was, I think, around 6:30 in the morning there, and it was nighttime in the United States. And then she heard something much more ominous than rocket fire. She said that her husband heard small arms fire. And I said, you've got to lock your doors immediately and tell your husband to get his weapon, because if you can hear small arms fire, the terrorists are inside your community right now. And she said, no, we hear echoes from the border. And I said, Sarah, I spent 45 years in the military. I know what the acoustics are in your kibbutz. I know how far it is from the border. If you hear small arms fire, they are in your community now. And then she said the thing that just absolutely killed me. She said, the lock on the door is broken and my husband doesn't have a weapon. And I said, just barricade with what you can and stay put. And stayed with her until about 4 o'clock in the morning in the United States, 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning in the United States. Eventually, she and her family were evacuated. What she didn't know at the time was that there was a pitched battle going on at the gate of her kibbutz and along the fence. And they had all in all a 9-man security team that repelled the terrorists with the help of one sort of rogue tank crew that just jumped into their tank and said, we're going to go help people. And they did it without orders, probably against orders, and they saved them. Unfortunately, those terrorists literally just crossed the street, the highway, into a kibbutz called Kfar Aza, and massacred and kidnapped almost 100 people.
Hearing that firsthand and seeing the destruction, knowing that people are still being held hostage in Gaza, they don't even know how many hostages are still alive right now.
No,
and then seeing what's happening, seeing what's happening over here with people, again, as you mentioned, protesting and denying that violence. What do you say to those people? There are people who denied that rape occurred on October 7th. They said that didn't happen.
Yes. There are people to this day who deny that there were gas chambers in Auschwitz or crematoria. The third episode of the documentary, as you pointed out, is called Hysteria, Hatred, and History. And I think there are two kinds of people who are demonstrating. The smaller number are hardcore Hamas supporters. And I'm that you're talking about the Students for Justice in Palestine at Columbia or throughout the United States. Those are hardcore Hamas operatives. They're Hamas mouthpieces. They get their orders from Hamas, and they're unapologetic about it. Then you have a group of white privileged kids who basically don't know what the hell they're talking about, have no clue. When you ask them, you're chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. What river is it and what sea is it? They can't give you an answer. Who have no idea about the history of that region, who call Jews and Israelis settler colonial occupiers, when in fact we are the indigenous people of that land. And that's indisputable, that we're the indigenous people of that land. That's archaeologically provable. There's no even slightest doubt about that. They have bought into this sort of bumper sticker mentality where there's a binary choice. And if you are Palestinian, I don't even know if they can define what that means. You are in effect, morally not culpable for anything, and you are a permanent victim. And if you are Israeli or a Jew, and I divide that because 20% of Israelis are in fact Muslim Arabs.
Right.
Israelis come in all sizes, shapes, colors, religions. There were Muslim Arabs who were killed on October 7th after they identified themselves as Muslim Arabs. There are Muslim Arabs who to this day are hostage in Gaza. I know the family whose family members are hostage in Gaza right now. That group of people, I think, sort of felt sorry that they missed out on the 60s, and so are, searching for a cause where they can feel morally superior to something, and that there's an enemy that they're fighting the good fight against. They really haven't a clue. When you see queers for Palestine, it's the equivalent of saying chickens for KFC. It is the stupidest thing on the face of the earth. Hamas executes gays, and by the way, not in a pleasant fashion. If you say code pink for Palestine, or you're for women's rights, may I tell you about the honor killings that are committed in Gaza and the West Bank by family members to murder women who were seen unescorted with a non-male relative? When people say I'm for freedom of the press, this is a regime which executes any journalist that doesn't toe the party line. When you say I'm for the oppressed minorities, this is an entity, a de facto state, which is unapologetically calling for the genocide of an ethno-religious group called the Jews. Unapologetically. And you've now gotten to the stage of the demonstrations where they're simply saying gas the Jews. So it's no longer, it's morphed into this sort of Jew hatred that's always been there, but now it's not only acceptable, it's virtuous. And that's, I will tell you that simply as an American, that is more troubling to me than it is as a Jew. As a Jew, we've survived worse, we'll survive this, and the days of Jews running and hiding and being defenseless are over. As an American, I see people in my country doing the same thing that ushered in the worst catastrophe in the history of Europe. And they're doing it willingly, chanting the same things with the same logic. And that is worrisome to me.
It's very worrisome. The Holocaust Museum, they have an essay on their website. It's posted, and it's called The 10 Stages of Genocide. The 10 stages that led up to the complete extermination in Germany of the Jews, where it was where they were rounding us up and our family members and putting us in gas chambers and starving us and shooting us down in the street. So I was reading it and I realized we're at stage 8 here in America. This is terrifying. They're beating up, you saw in Los Angeles.
Yes.
Sure, you saw that.
Yes.
They were hunting Jews in the street. They were driving up and getting out of their cars and beating people up, women. That's where we are right now. Let's talk about the heroism. One thing that you did mention, and it was in your, or you alluded to in the docu-series, is that there was some kind of a failure, a senior level failure of officials on October 7th. What do you mean by that?
There was a complete and total failure of the senior echelons, both of the Israeli military and the entire Israeli intelligence community. And having served in the Yom Kippur War and been in Israel in the Yom Kippur War, I hate to say a half a century ago, but it was the Yom Kippur War redux. In other words, it was not a failure to collect intelligence that would have said there is about to be a massacre. it was a failure to see what was right in front of you. The junior officers, I remember telling my wife, they're going to find that a bunch of very bright young corporals and sergeants and junior officers laid the picture out perfectly for the senior leadership. And the senior leadership looked at it and said, yeah, but it'll never happen. Because we have a concept. We believe that Hamas has turned a corner. They want to govern. They're not interested in war. They're incapable of large-scale maneuvering. And there was this, the Israeli army, to a degree, has been corrupted by an American over-reliance on technology. There's a flaw in the American military, which is an over-reliance on gadgets over human intelligence. And Israel's been infected by that same malady. They fell in love with gadgets, early warning systems, remote-controlled machine guns and sensors, and all those things can be overcome. Human intelligence is what should tell you what the intention of the enemy is and what their capability is. And then you should look at it objectively and say, well, I guess we better get ready and do something preemptively because we're about to be attacked. And that didn't happen. That was on the intelligence side. On the senior level of the military side, you have commanders who I would say for probably the last 5 years, 4 or 5 years, especially since there was a dust up in 2021, so it's 3 years, believed this conception and trained troops and maintained alerts accordingly. So people, the guy who was the commander of Southern Command, whom I know, should have resigned. The guy who was the commander of the Gaza division took responsibility and he did resign. Everybody should have put their resignations on the table and said, as soon as we get through X stage of the war and can ensure a smooth transition, we're commanders. We take responsibility. The buck stops with us and we resign. And you just tell us when you want the resignation to go into effect. But they should have offered those resignations on day one. They failed. While the senior echelons failed, ordinary Israelis, individual soldiers, police, paramedics, off-duty soldiers, off-duty police, and ordinary citizens up through grandparents refused to be victims. And they saved themselves, their families, their neighbors, their communities, and many times complete strangers. And I could have filled the entire 4 hours plus of that documentary series with the stories of heroism that took place that day. They bought with their gallantry enough time for the Israeli army to regroup, and they stepped into the breach and they saved the state of Israel.
So how do you balance the in this docu-series, the portrayal of the horror of October 7th with the heroism? It's a sensitive, it's a complex topic, but how do you ensure a fair narrative?
Well,
meaning
the
not
narrative,
putting the Israeli government, on blast, so to speak, sort of to having criticism of them, but also appreciating what they're doing to protect Israel, I guess is what I mean. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it balances out very nicely in that episode called The Horror, and certainly later. It begins with, here's what happened on that day. And because I knew that there would be denial, I made sure to include a clip with Israel's top forensic pathologists who, not relying on first responders, not relying on witnesses, not relying on survivors. Here's Hamas's body cam footage of a family they have just kidnapped after they have murdered the eldest daughter. You can watch them, see the interplay, what they are saying. Here's the Hamas body cam footage dragging a girl who's just been raped. It's very obvious she's been raped by the bloodstains on her pants, by her hair, and taking her into a Jeep, crying out, Allahu Akbar. Here are the people being kidnapped and dragged into Gaza. This is Hamas's footage. You can't deny it. But then it goes into a segment with the top forensic pathologist in Israel and his team doing a news conference and saying, okay, here's a photograph. Now, you can't tell what this photograph is, so we're going to show you the CT scan. It is so badly charred that you can't tell that it is actually two human beings. It is so badly charred that you can't tell that it's actually an adult and a child. But here are the two spines. Here are the two sets of ribs. And here is the wire that tied them together while they were burned alive. And we know they were burned alive because when I opened up the trachea, there is soot in the trachea, which means they were breathing while they were dying. They weren't shot and then burned. It is absolutely irrefutable. And then you unfortunately see the containers full of dead bodies. And so it's a clear documentation of what it was, which was the horrors. I didn't want to just leave it with that because I thought that was too awful, quite frankly, for just to do a recitation of horrors, because hand in hand with that was the heroism. And it then tells two stories, one of an off-duty SWAT team member in Sderot, who, together with his teammates, defeated the terrorists who had basically taken over Sderot and took over the Sderot police station in an absolutely heroic battle. Then it tells the story of a guy who's identified only as Mickey from Kibbutz Nahal Oz, who also was an off-duty member of an elite SWAT team. They had come, they knew exactly where he lived. They knew what house he was in. They had great intelligence. They wanted to take him alive. They wanted to take him hostage. He was there with his wife and daughter. His wife and daughter heard the gunfire, just as I heard my sister say, the gunfire is coming towards us. And I said, you've got to bar the door. They were in the same shape, except he had a weapon and he was highly trained. And the wife said to him, we're not going out there. We're not going to be kidnapped. If it comes down to it, and she mimed so the daughter wouldn't see, you kill me, you kill yourself, you kill our daughter. And he was prepared to do that. They were not going to be taken. He was a highly, highly trained fighter. And over the course of the next several hours, he killed 14 terrorists who tried to break into his house. And he saved his family and he saved some of his neighbors. And he's guilty that he didn't save others. So that episode ends with those two stories about the heroism, and then leads into the next episode, which is totally about acts of heroism. These two guys were highly trained. They were really Rambos. The next episode that dealt with the heroism dealt with just honestly ordinary people, three overweight, balding, middle-aged paramedics who saved hundreds of people that day. A 65-year-old grandmother who outwitted the 5 terrorists who held her and her husband hostage, holding a hand grenade, live grenade, to her head. And she outsmarted them and defeated them with tea and motherly advice and homemade cookies. Stories of, again, guys in a security team. They weren't Rambos. These guys are overweight. They're balding. They're middle-aged. They heard that the terrorists were already inside another community that was 6 miles away from them. There were only 9 members on their security team. 7 of them went to defend that community of total strangers, leaving only 2 people in their kibbutz to defend their own families. All 7 of them were wounded. 2 of them were killed, but they defeated the terrorists and prevented a massacre in that community. And these were not Rambos. These were just guys who fought for their lives and fought for total strangers. So it's an extraordinarily inspiring story. And like I say, it scratched the surface. I mean, I did a half-hour special about Noam Tibon, who was a retired major general, who heard from his son in Nahal Oz that the terrorists were literally outside the doorstep. He had 2 granddaughters there, his son and daughter-in-law. He grabbed a pistol. He lives in Tel Aviv, and he drove south with the intent of trying to rescue his son. He didn't realize the magnitude of the military failure. On the way, he was in 2 firefights. He saved 2 people who were running from the Supernova Music Festival, evacuated them, even though he knew that in doing that, it might cost his own son his life. But he said, my values wouldn't permit me to turn my back on people who were innocent, who needed me to save them, because if I didn't, they would have been dead. And then in a firefight that he was in, together with some paratroopers, one of the paratrooper officers was shot in the stomach, which is about as nasty a wound as you can get, and was looking at being dead in a half hour, and not a pleasant death. And he loaded him into his Jeep and drove back in the opposite direction to save that youngster's life, even though he knew he could be signing his son and his daughter-in-law and grandchildren's death warrant. And he said, my values would not permit me to turn my back on him. That's an extraordinary people. That is such an uplifting story. We have such an extraordinary people in Israel and in the Jewish people. The magnitude of the horror of that day is only matched by the courage of those people who fought back.
You know what? That story is amazing, and I'm just so dumbfounded, and I don't think any of us will have an answer on the Israeli side of why people can look at those videos and see those videos and still say, oh well, it's resistance.
Yes, but
oh well, yeah. It's fake. Oh well, I don't believe it. Oh well, they deserved it. I don't see how a child can deserve being kidnapped.
Yeah.
But I still, it's been 7-8 months almost, and I can't wrap my head around that part of it.
Yes, it's become this binary. I mean, in the thing that we have called hysteria, hatred, and history, yes, there was a teach-in of Native Americans who have aligned themselves with Hamas. Correct. And they were saying, one of the young chaps who's a University of Minnesota student, and the person who's moderating this is a tenured professor at the University of Minnesota. I, as a federal taxpayer, help pay part of her salary. Anybody who lives in Minnesota pays part of her salary. And there she is saying, not just that Israel is a settler, occupier, colonial oppressor, but that the greatest predator empire in the history of the world is the United States of America, which must, for the sake of all life on planet Earth, and I'm quoting exactly, be dismantled and decolonized. And you sit there and say, we are committing collective suicide. We are educating a generation of people to hate this country. Forget Israel, forget the Jews, forget Israelis. The number of youngsters who said, you know what, I looked at Osama bin Laden and he had it right.
That's insane.
Yes, it is. It's insane. And it is this notion of you count up the casualties on one side, and if there are more casualties on one side than the other, then the one with the most casualties are the victims, and the one with the least casualties are the oppressors. By which logic, we should dig up Adolf Hitler's remains and apologize.
You know, I have a friend who escaped the Nova Festival, and the videos that he showed me, that he videotaped when he was running, is terrifying.
Yes.
And by the grace of God, he got out. I mean, he was rescued, you know, and he hid in trees, and he climbed up trees and hid, and was videotaping them, literally lynching people. Like, this is insane. So to hear that, especially from a professor, it's so disturbing. As far as historical, social, political ramifications of October 7th, what do you want viewers of your docu-series to take away?
We're at an inflection point. We are right now worldwide at, I think, an unprecedented inflection point. When the Nazis took over Germany and began persecuting the Jews faced indifference in other countries. Now we're in a situation in which there is a worldwide identification with the Nazis of our time and a vilification of the Jews worldwide. And we are always the canary in the mine. Every civilization can stick its finger in the wind and see where it's going by how the Jews in its society are treated. If they are vilified, if they are convicted in the court of public opinion of insane blood libels, that civilization is in dire trouble. In dire trouble. And it must take steps to prevent its ruination. In the ones where they didn't, they paid a price that was unimaginable. Nazi Germany. In places where people stood up to that kind of insane prejudice, as the United States did in the Civil Rights era, as the United States did in the Civil War, they beat down the forces of darkness and progressed a few inches up the ladder of human evolution in terms of righteousness. We're at that inflection point right now, and we better get our heads out of our asses, pardon my French, and understand that we literally are educating a generation to hate this country, its values, and to identify with the absolute basest people on the face of the earth. You know, when ISIS, and I think this is the way in which one has to see this, when ISIS massacred the Yazidi people in 2014, do you know how many countries formed a coalition to defeat ISIS? Any idea?
No.
87. 87 nations, including the very people who are today condemning Israel, said we have to unite. And they had, as Bill Clinton used to say, no dog in that fight. They didn't share a border with ISIS. They weren't related to the Yazidi people, but they said, look, when you mass rape, when you burn people alive, when you behead people to the shouts of Allahu Akbar, when you massacre whole families, you are so far beyond the pale and so abominable that 87 nations must unite to destroy you, not to negotiate with you, not to reach a negotiated settlement, not to have a ceasefire, but to destroy you. There is nothing that ISIS did that Hamas didn't do exactly the same. By the way, you know what country wasn't in that coalition? Israel. You know why Israel wasn't in that coalition? Because all of the Arab states that were a part of it would have quit if Israel had joined the fight against them.
How about that? Speaking of ISIS, there was a report this morning that the Department of Homeland Security here in the United States, they arrested about 100, I believe it was over 100 people that an ISIS group had sent over here through the southern border. There's still about 50 that they haven't located.
Yes.
That's scary.
And
considering that they have a lot of support here now in the United States.
Absolutely.
That's scary.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the people who are apologists for Hamas are miracle grow for ISIS. They will embolden every ISIS terrorist and operative on the face of the earth and their allies. And plane hijackings, people ought to remember, began against Israel in the 1970s, 1960s, actually, the first ones, and then the 1970s. They ended at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and in a field in Pennsylvania.
Right.
It will come back to bite us on the ass.
And it took them 10 years to plan 9/11, of people coming over here
Yes.
to this country, integrating, going to colleges here, training here, and then turning
Yeah.
against America. And then that happened. But we're seeing it. The only difference now is they're not doing it in secret. They're doing it in front of our eyes.
And they're being celebrated.
Yes.
They're being celebrated. They're freedom fighters. They are the new freedom fighters. And there is nothing in the ISIS ideology that is not in the Hamas ideology. Absolutely nothing. They both want to establish a worldwide caliphate. Hamas isn't interested in a Palestinian state. There's nothing in the Hamas charter that talks about being interested in a Palestinian state. They're an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood that wants a caliphate. And the Europeans, bless their hearts, as we say down south, you know, they regard Spain and Vienna as occupied territory because they were once Muslim. Those are Muslim Waqf lands, which means once having been Muslim lands, they are forever Muslim lands. And the infidels who occupy them now need either to be defeated, converted, or tolerated as a dhimmi status that pays a tax, and you allow them to live as subhumans in your culture.
All right. Well, I want to just thank you again. I absolutely appreciate your time. I think this has been very amazing. You've given me some awesome stuff to work with here.
Well, let me, if I may, just add one final thing.
Please go ahead.
And
whatever you want to say. Add as much as you want.
The fourth episode is called The Hope.
Okay. Oh, right.
And
what is the hope? Where do we get hope right now?
Okay, there is a tiny, tiny window of opportunity, and it is not up to Israel. It is up to the United States and the international community. Because if they force Israel into a premature ceasefire that leaves Hamas in power, there is no hope. But if Israel is allowed to eliminate Hamas as a governing and military entity, which doesn't mean you kill the ideology, it doesn't mean you defeat every last Hamas soldier. It means that, as we did with ISIS, we deprived them of a base of operations. We turned them once again into a terrorist movement instead of a de facto state. At that point, there needs to be a coalition, and there are willing partners who will do this in the Gulf states, who, just as we had a denazification policy in Germany after World War II, where Nazi literature was banned, Nazi membership was banned, the entire education system has to be completely overturned. I interviewed a man named Marcus Scheff, who's the CEO of a non-governmental agency that monitors education systems in the Middle East and Africa regions. He said that the curriculum that is taught in the Palestine Authority schools, which is also taught in Gaza by UNRWA, not by Hamas, by UNRWA, that curriculum is by far the worst of any Arab country anywhere in the world in terms of raising a generation of people who believe that jihad and martyrdom is the goal of their life. So we in America, who are the biggest donors to UNRWA, are paying to educate a generation of people for violent jihad against not only Israel, but eventually against the United States. It is complete insanity. So there is a moment where we can say, we will, as an international community, say we're going to rewrite the curricula of the school. That area of the world can become paradise. I have been in Gaza so much in my life, back in what was called the occupation, which many citizens of Gaza look back to now as a golden age, when they could work in Israel, when they made a good living, where there were no checkpoints, by the way. People traveled freely back and forth to Gaza. Gazans came into Israel and bought and worked and went to the beach, and Israelis went to Gaza and did the same. There is a chance to say there will be a new curriculum in the school. We are going to educate a generation for peace. God forbid, not for love for Israel, but for love for themselves. The Palestinian people have for too long been sacrificed to generational misery and martyrdom on the genocidal altar of a regime that cares more about the death of the Jews than the lives of the Palestinians. When you can flip that paradigm, and you can, take a look at the Gulf states, take a look at the Emirates, take a look at even the Saudis today, which once was a hotbed of Wahhabi Islam. You can change curricula. You can change the way people think. You can take a look at Nazi Germany. The Nazis weren't appalled by Hitler. They applauded him. It took a generation to be re-educated so that they looked back and said, my God, we were insane. We brought about disaster on ourselves. That can happen, but it will only happen if the West is courageous and not pusillanimous, which is one of my favorite words. If you don't know it, look it up. It's a great word. It describes what the United States is right now and what the West is right now. If the United States and the West say, we cannot tolerate what is coming towards us, we need to draw the line in the sand here and say, you know what? Just as we defeated ISIS, we need to dismantle the same ideology of Hamas and provide an alternative, a political horizon in which you say, there will be a Gaza first policy and let it become the first independent Palestinian state. It already was a de facto independent state. But when it was left to the Gazans to decide who they wanted to rule, they chose Hamas. How did that work out for humanity?
What about UNRWA? We've seen soldiers discovering Nazi propaganda literature in UNRWA schools.
UNRWA has become completely co-opted by Hamas. It's an arm of Hamas. The UN is the most ineffectual, two-faced organization imaginable. UNRWA no longer has a function to fulfill in Gaza of any kind. It needs to be a coalition of Gulf state and Egyptian and Saudi Arabs who basically institute the same curricula that is taught in the Emirates. That's a spectacular curricula in educating a generation for peace. This is not a Jewish state. These are Arab, strict Muslims who have put in place an educational curriculum aimed at creating a generation who strives for peace. That's all. They don't need to love Israel. They don't need to love Zion. They don't need to be against a two-state solution. I will tell you right now that if, as will 90% of Israelis, if you tell me that the Palestinian state that lives next door to me can be guaranteed to live in good neighborliness with me, I don't even need them to love me or be friends. Just be good neighbors. That's all. You will find that 90% of Israelis will help that state not only come into existence, but help it thrive. That area geographically is so blessed. It's the gateway between Europe and the Arab world and Africa. It can become Dubai. Hamas turned it into Somalia.
Do you see an end to this anytime soon? We're all praying for it.
I see a transition.
Okay.
But I don't see an end. Israel, the illusion that we can live next to Hezbollah and survive, that we can be surrounded by an Iranian ring of fire, which is the Iranian term, not Dan Gordon's term, and survive long term, I think is over. We will have to confront Hezbollah. We will have to confront, Hezbollah is the tentacle, the head is Iran. And you've got a country of 90 million people who are so strong, they sell arms to the Russians. And the West has kowtowed to them since the Obama administration, unfortunately. And we are reaping the whirlwind right now. And that has to get turned around because eventually, not for Israel's sake, for the United States' sake. If we look at, as Americans, we face an axis, and I hate to quote, George Bush or the axis of evil, or Ronald Reagan, who I don't mind quoting, who was talking about the evil empire. We face an axis of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. They are allies. They support each other. It is as much an axis as Japan, Germany, and fascist Italy was in World War II. They have not yet coalesced their war plans against the West, but they will. If we can pick off Iran now and neutralize it, we have a chance of getting through the rest of the 21st century without a world war. If we don't, we won't.
How did the U.S. get it so wrong? These mass people supporting Hamas and Hezbollah, which is shocking to see. How did they get it so wrong? How is the misinformation machine so strong? Their propaganda is so strong. How is it? I feel the only way to combat that is with docu-series such as yours, and people need to go in with an open mind.
And look, in this country, I'm Michael Oren, who is a good pal of mine, Israel's former ambassador to the United States. And he's Dr. Michael Oren. He's one of the foremost historians about the Middle East. Has written some wonderful articles where he talks about the corruption of the American universities, especially in the areas of Middle Eastern studies, but also in the areas of journalism, where really the turning point started to be sort of in the late 80s, early 90s. And you began seeing a shift. And he said, you tell me who the person is. I can listen to him for 5 minutes. I can not only tell you what university he went to, I can tell you what professors he had, because they were so indoctrinating in their approach. And it started really with Edward Said at Columbia University in the 90s, and then followed suit. And you had this orthodoxy, which now is in all of the universities, which is it's sort of a neo-Marxism, which instead of seeing the world in terms of capitalist and proletariat, sees the world in terms of oppressor and oppressed. And there's a binary choice. If you're white and European, you are the ipso facto the oppressor. If you are neither of those two things, you are ipso facto not morally culpable for anything you may do, not responsible for any choices you may make, and you are the oppressed. And look at the slogans: by any means. You can use any means to fight back against your settler colonial occupiers, which is how the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand are all seen. England is a different story. They're simply a colonial oppressor. They're not a settler occupier project. But that has taken hold in America's universities. And thank God it hasn't yet taken hold in all the high schools, but I think you find it on both coasts in high schools now. And that really needs to change. Otherwise, we are marching towards collective suicide.
Ooh. And on that note, any final words?
Well, I hope people will tune in on Friday and watch, Hysteria, Hatred, and History. It will be an eye-opener, especially since I trace the roots of the so-called Palestinian resistance to the alliance between Haj Amin al-Husseini, the George Washington of the Palestinian resistance, and Nazi Germany and fascist Italy in the 1920s and 30s. It is not that this is the political landscape of the 60s. They were not anti-colonial, they were anti-Jewish. The same person, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who sparked the massacres, of which October 7th was simply an echo of the massacres of the 1920s and 1930s that happened in Jewish communities throughout the Middle East, and not just, by the way, in British Mandatory Palestine. He instituted what was called the Farhud, which was the massacre of the Jews of Baghdad, who had lived there since the Babylonian exile. He instituted the massacre of the Jews of Cairo, who had lived there, some of them, since the days of Moses. So this notion that the Palestinian resistance is actually an anti-colonialist movement, no. Buzzer, wrong. It actually is an anti-Jewish movement, and its roots are the alliance between the Palestinian quote unquote resistance of the 1930s and Nazi Germany. And by the way, that's where Haj Amin al-Husseini spent World War II, was in Nazi Germany, advising Hitler on how to set up death camps in the Middle East after Rommel conquered the Middle East. And then he went on to have his own bureau inside the Nazi bureaucracy and set up Muslim death squads in the former Yugoslavia, whose goal was killing Serbs and Roma and Jews. He was a wanted war criminal after World War II and had to flee Europe and go to Egypt, where he was welcomed. And the German historian, Matthias Kunzel, has said that the shift of the heart of anti-Semitism then shifted from Nazi-occupied Europe to the Middle East, where it has stayed ever since. So, yeah, I hope people watch that, because they don't know their history. They certainly don't know the history of the Jews or the Middle East or our connection to that land, and they don't know the history of the movement that they're out there supporting today.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
Thank you for having